As Caleb said, my name's Scott. I work at CCM. Live in Finsbury Park in London. It's not too far away from UCL. My UCL fun fact is that my wife did her master's degree there many years ago now, but she was at UCL, so she's got fond memories of it. So we know it a little bit. We're thinking about hope today. I wonder what you're hoping for at the minute. And there's lots of things we're hoping for, aren't we? We're hoping for an end to lockdown. If you're currently in a place that's in lockdown, we're hoping for a vaccine to the coronavirus. We're hoping for an end to all the limitations on our lives. Maybe you're hoping for something like your degree. Maybe you're a finalist and your degree is coming to an end. And beyond that, for a career, for a family, whatever it might be. Think about hope today. The Cambridge Dictionary defines hope as this: to want something to happen or to be true, and you usually have a good reason to think it might. So you want something to happen or be true, and you usually have a good reason to think that it might. Hope keeps us going. Hope lifts us, it inspires us to do great things. We've seen that, haven't we, as you look back in history. History of politics, civil rights movements, even as Caleb said, the current Black Lives Matter protest. It's hope for something greater, and it enables people to do things that are very sacrificial, motivated by hope and giving hope to others. Hal Lindsey, a writer in the States, writes this: man can live about 40 days without food, about 3 days without water, about 8 minutes without air, but only for 1 second without hope. Hope, we cannot live without it. Another writer, Andrew Delbanco, writes this: we must imagine some end of life that transcends our own tiny allotment of days and hours if we are to keep at bay the dim, back of the mind suspicion that we are adrift in an absurd world. See what he's saying there? We must have something that we hope in this life. Now, historically, I guess most people have thought of God, of whatever kind, as the end or the purpose of life that transcends us, that is that something bigger or higher. In society, certainly in Western society in particular these days, that's not so common. We don't really hope in God as a society. There are other things we hope in. We hope firstly in the goodness and the progress of humanity. The relentless, the hope that we're getting better. John Lennon's classic song, if you know it, "Imagine all the people living life in peace," is a sort of a powerful message of hope, of a future where humanity is united, where in love, where there's no greed, there's no hunger, all people share what they have. And of course, that's a nice vision. And yet, as we look back at the history of the 20th century in particular, in the 20th century, more people were killed by war or genocide than in the previous 19 centuries combined. We've had vast economic expansion throughout the 20th century, and yet instead of wiping out greed and hunger, those things have only increased. There is greater inequality than ever before. There's greater exploitation of our natural resources. There's environmental crisis. We've had 2 world wars, terrorism, sex trafficking, ongoing racism rearing its head again, even in the 21st century in the most developed nation in the world. And wonderful as it sounds, John Lennon's vision, it doesn't sound like much more than a dream. Imagine all the people living life in peace. So maybe we shouldn't hope in the goodness of humanity, but how about the sort of inevitable progress of technology? Maybe we shouldn't look to humans, but to technology as our hope. I mean, if you look, our technical abilities in the areas of science, engineering, tech, design, they are amazing, the things that humanity has been able to do. Maybe that's where our hope is to be found, in Facebook, in Google, in Zoom, even, in a vaccine for coronavirus, in an end to sickness. But of course, technology in itself doesn't guide itself. Who is to say that we are not just becoming more skilled and effective at blowing each other up? Actually, that's gone hand in hand with our increased technological capacity. who's to say we're not just getting better at spying on each other, at creating division and pouring fuel on the fires of hatred through social media and other things. So maybe there isn't inevitable progress through technology. Maybe that's not where our hope should lie. Maybe it should lie in future generations. That's how most of the world actually looks for hope. The idea that the next generation will be better, that we'll be able to pass on our wisdom and our wealth to those who come after us, and we hope that they will have a better life than we do. But of course, you look at sort of environmental crisis in particular, you think, what sort of world are we passing on to future generations? Can we really hope in that? Some people, of course, as they look around at those things, the things we sometimes hope in, they just conclude that hope in itself is just wishful thinking, and that it is just merely a trick that our brain plays on us to somehow make this world a little bit more bearable. And in that case, we should probably change our definition of hope to things we want to happen or be true, but those things that we have no good reason to think will actually happen. Our old friend Nietzsche sums it up well, doesn't he? He says this, he says, hope in reality is the worst of all evils because it prolongs the torments of man. That's not very encouraging, isn't it? But that is the sort of honest assessment of where a look at hope in this world sort of gets you, if that's all you've got. And of course, if we're being honest, really honest, the biggest issue that stands in the way of hope is something we haven't even mentioned yet, and that is death. Death is well, for many of us, will be particularly personal and painful. Maybe at the minute we're confronted all the more with the reality of death as the world wrestles with this virus. Death is the great roadblock on the horizon, and whatever we hope for, death will cut it off, or at least it will cut us off from it, so that we're not able to enjoy the thing we were hoping for. It doesn't matter how clever you are, how rich you are, how many lawyers or accountants you can employ, death will come to us all. And here's what Andrew Del Banco writes. Again, he says, any history of hope must make room at its center for this dogged companion of hope, the lurking suspicion that all our getting and spending amounts to nothing more than fidgeting while we wait for death. See what he's saying there? He's saying we can't live without hope, but death robs our hope. See, the goodness of humanity we might hope in, well, death means I won't experience it. And actually, if I'm going to die soon, well, why shouldn't I just get and exploit and oppress others? What about the inevitability of progress? Well, again, so much of our progress has just made us more expert in killing as much as in healing. And future generations, well, they'll face the same problem. They'll face death. They'll live in a world that is marked by death. None of those things that we hope in can really stand up under the shadow of death. It robs real hope. Okay, it hasn't been very encouraging so far. That's not what I'm here to do. Let me then try and say why it is that Jesus Christ offers something unique, why he offers a real hope that stands up under the shadow of death. And we're going to just share in the chat a link to a Bible passage, the Bible passage that we're going to look at today. It's John 11. It's an encounter that Jesus has with a family. You may find it helpful to just click on the link and have the text of the Bible passage up in front of you. Can we get that up on the chat? He's got there, great. We've just popped it on the chat. You may want to find it just so you can follow along. I'll read different bits of it as we go, but you'd find it helpful probably to have it in front of you. John 11, we're introduced to a family that we're told that Jesus loved. It's a guy called Lazarus and his two sisters, Mary and Martha. And Lazarus is ill. In fact, he's so ill that death is very close. And then in verse 3, we're told, so the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is ill. When he heard this, Jesus said, this illness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. That's an extraordinary thing to say, isn't it? When someone is at death's door, that something better is about to happen. And don't miss the context, that the relationship that Jesus has with this family. Look at verse 5. Verse 5, it says, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. And that comes up a few times in this story. The writer doesn't want us to miss it, that Jesus loves these three. And that makes what comes next really surprising. He loves them. So, verse 6, when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was 2 more days. That makes no sense, does it? Love causes Jesus to delay. He loves Lazarus, so he doesn't go straight away. And at this point, if you're Mary or Martha or Lazarus, Jesus' love makes very little sense to you. But remember, we're only in the middle of the story, aren't we? We're only at the beginning of the story, really. And in the middle of the story, things often don't make sense. So let's carry on. Let's skip on down to verse 11. After he had said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has just fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up. Isn't that interesting? Death is the great enemy that robs our hope, and the grim reaper with 100% hit rate. And yet Jesus sees death the way you or I see sleep. That's how he describes it. I mean, is he just deluded? Is he just supremely arrogant? Who does he think he is? Well, let's again see how the story ends. At verse 12, his disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. He says, my good friend has died. And by the way, this is good news. Verse 17, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. That means he's properly dead. In the ancient world, the 3 days was sort of, after 3 days was the point that you wouldn't go near the body because it would start to decompose, and you would no longer enter the tomb because the body was person was dead and gone. Went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. It's an extraordinary thing to say, isn't it? If Jesus had been here, my brother would not have died. I don't know if you know anyone like that. A good friend whose mere presence you think is powerful enough to overcome death. But for some reason, that's what these women who knew Jesus well seemed to think about him. And so to Martha, Jesus says in verse 23, Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Now at this point, it turns into a bit of a theological discussion. Jews at the time believed that there would be a resurrection of the dead at the end of time. And so Martha says at verse 24, I know he will rise again in the resurrection of the last day. But Jesus then says something that's so remarkable that she wouldn't have been able to make sense of it at the time. Verse 25, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? What Jesus means by saying that, we'll get to at the end of the story, and ultimately at the end of John's story, in John's gospel. But Martha responds positively. She says, yes, Lord. Verse 27, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. So she goes and she calls her sister, Mary. When Mary reached the place, verse 32, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. We just see here that Jesus weeps at the pain of death, at the destruction that it wreaks in the world. But then verse 37, but some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept the man from dying? People think it's the end of the story. They think this friend of Jesus has died. And if that is the end of the story, then there is no hope. Death wins every time. It mocks all our hopes. But even though death is the great enemy, we try and run from it all the time. Jesus moves towards it. Verse 38, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days. Martha, even though she's a pre-modern, non-scientific person, she gets that after 4 days, the body is decomposing. It is horrific. You don't go anywhere near the tomb. And yet Jesus said, verse 40, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. He calls to a dead man, dead and buried, 4 days in the tomb, decomposing. And yet Jesus just calls him by name, Lazarus, come out. Now look, if you're researchers, you could go down to your local cemetery and you could run this experiment, 1,000 times. And I'm pretty confident what the result would be 100% of the time. And yet, this one time, in this one place, with this one person speaking, what happens? Verse 44. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth round his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Jesus calls him and he comes. And you see, this episode, this amazing miracle is pointing us back to the claim of verse 25. I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. By raising Lazarus, Jesus actually signed his own death warrant. Just a few chapters later, Jesus will say, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friend. And that's where this leads for Jesus, to his own death, but also to his resurrection from the dead, where we see how verse 25 is really true. See, the shadow of death robs real hope unless there's resurrection. See, without resurrection, there is no real hope for humanity. But with resurrection, there is hope for humanity. And so the claim right at the heart of the Christian faith is that only Jesus can offer real hope. I don't know what you think about that. I don't know how many times you've heard that, or whether that's new to you. But that is the claim of the Christian message, that real hope is found only in Jesus.
A lot of us are interested in where we should draw the line between being hopeful and being unrealistic.
Hi everyone. Again, apologies. I think the connection problem was probably at my end. That's why I've moved to somewhere where hopefully the Wi-Fi is a little bit stronger. The difference between being hopeful and unrealistic. I think, I guess most other hopes are, it's very hard to ground them in anything. So those other examples that I gave of, hope in the progress of humanity. Well, what are you going on? That is that you may, if you take a historical view, you may say that's unrealistic, because although we've progressed in some ways, we haven't in others. And so, how can you say, well, we'll just never get better? So I think all the things that we hope in have flaws in that way. I think the difference that the message of Jesus gives is that the hope is grounded in his life, death, and resurrection. So he isn't just some interesting thinker, some philosopher who had some interesting ideas about death and what comes after death, and he isn't just a thinker saying, "Come and follow my ideas." That's a good way to live. They are grounded in the reality of his death and resurrection. He has beaten death. He has entered death and come through the other side, and so that grounds the promises that he gives, that there is hope beyond death, because they're based on reality, not just on ideas. So I think that the Christian hope gives a more tangible, it is more realistic, because it is based on, it's not just ideas, it is based on what he has achieved. That doesn't enable me to hope for everything now. That doesn't mean that all my hopes will be realized, but it does deal with that the big barrier to all of our hopes, which is death. Did anyone want to come back on that? Or?
Yeah, thank you. And how do you hold on to hope without being detached from the present reality?
Yeah, that's a question. I mean, I'd say it's similar in that if there really is hope beyond death now, that enables you to live well now, because you live differently to those who live with a fear of death. If this life is all I'm living for, then yes, I just grab at whatever I can now, whether that's experience or success or the things that people live for. If I have a firm hope in something to come, it changes how I live now. It impacts the decisions that I make. It doesn't mean I walk around with my head in the clouds, as if this world isn't real. It actually it allows me to experience and live in this world now in the way that I was meant to, knowing that it's not the be all and end all. So I don't know if you find at the minute the idea that in lockdown you should be able to do everything. I should be learning 5 languages and watching everything that's now free to stream. I should be watching this theatre production and that theatre. I should learn how to knit and how to make ice cream, and actually that the pressure, that the sense that, well, this time only lasts, who knows how long this will last, and so I must make the most of it, otherwise what am I doing with my life? And that becomes almost paralyzing. The sense that enough is never enough, and I think that is how you end up living if you don't have a Christian hope. But a Christian hope allows you a freedom in this life to live well, to live how you were created to live, and enjoy that without feeling, gosh, if I don't do everything, I'm really missing out, because there is a hope that that you'll have all eternity with Jesus, without all the stuff that makes this world naff. And perfectly with him. I will enjoy everything then, and that frees me to live now.
Yeah, thank you. It's that hope that is it affects our actions. So we have another question about social injustice. So how does the Christian hope link with it, and can we hope for anything out of it?
Yes, there's lots of things that we could say on that. Again, it's linked to the last question, isn't it? If there really is hope beyond death, then well, it's linked to more than just hope, isn't it? It's not just that I hope, you might say if you're hoping beyond death, you don't care what happens here. And so, injustice isn't a big deal because, but actually that's never how the Bible talks about it. The Bible is deeply passionate about justice. God is deeply passionate about justice because he created this world. He knows that this world is not how it should be, and that there is there is a world to come in which all the things that mar this world will not be.
Sorry for the technical connectivity issues.
I'm blaming Virgin Media. What was I saying? I think I got to the point of saying that the thing that people are longing for now is something better. That to say that people are, that it's not good enough to say that people are treated differently because of the color of their skin or oppressed because they're black, and that comes from a deep-rooted belief that there is something better, that this world is not how it should be, and we are hoping for more. So I think as you look back in history, certainly in the civil rights movement, but more than that, you see that Christians have always actually been at the center of that. I mean, Martin Luther King is the obvious example, that his understanding of the fact that people were made in the image of God, that gave them worth and value, was a key foundation for all that, for that whole civil rights movement. That a sense that that there is a God behind this world who is a God of justice, and so to work for justice now, that's where that was coming from. It wasn't, rather than the opposite, or someone was just hoping for another world, and so didn't bother, didn't care what was going on in this. Absolutely not. That's just not how it's played out in history.
Yeah, thank you. I do agree that when we focus on the Christian hope, we can realize what human values are. So, social injustice is the disrespect of these core values of being human and being the God's image. More into the biblical events side of things. Why did Jesus wait for 2 days before going to Lazarus? So why did Jesus wait, even though Lazarus is at need? And if he had power to raise him, why did he wait?
Yeah, it's really striking, isn't it? And the fact that it explicitly says, when he heard, verse 6 of John 11, when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was 2 more days. The reason that he stayed is that he loved him, which seems totally counterintuitive to us. And yet later on he says, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you believe, but let us go to him. So there is something about the delay that increases the magnitude of what Jesus then does. I guess it's slightly the difference between, people say, I was dead for 8 minutes. I had a heart attack once, and I was dead for 8 minutes. So their heart had stopped, and then I was, then they put on whatever those machines are called. What are they called? The heart. The heart, they give you an electric shock and get you going again. It's totally gone out of my head what they're called, but it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? And that kick starts it again. I guess it's the difference between that sort of, I was sort of technically sort of dead. I'd stopped breathing for a while, and I was, my heart actually stopped beating for 24 hours or something. I think it's the equivalent in the sort of in the culture of the time. The 3 days was a significant period of time. That's when you would embalm the body, and you would have the funeral, and you would, the sort of official mourning with the body would take place over those 3 days, and anything beyond that, that was the sort of end of those sort of activities. And so for it to be 4 days that he was dead, rubber stamped dead, death registered at the registry office, starting to look, clear out the house and all those sort of things. So I think it is to magnify the scale of what Jesus does. Jesus knew what he was going to do. He could have just, spoken and Lazarus would have got better, or he could have just spoken as soon as Lazarus died and he would have been raised. But there's something about the delay that magnifies it all the more. That means, more people knew that Lazarus was dead, and so more people see that he's alive. And I think that helps us when we see injustice now, when we see that, if God has this power, why doesn't he just stop all injustice and all disease and all those sorts of things now? Well, in some sense, there's a little picture of he's got a bigger purpose that we cannot see, but that one day when he does remake this world and restore it, actually it will be all the greater for the delay. I think there's something in that.
Yeah, thank you. And we actually have a very similar question, and we, like some of us, are also interested in why can't we just see the fulfillment of this hope now? Why is God waiting? So you have, I think you have answered some parts of it already. So will you have anything to add on?
Not a whole lot. No, I think it is that. It is that sense of he is waiting because he has plans and purposes that we cannot always comprehend or will not always fully understand. And so the Bible would say he's waiting for those who he's waiting for people to turn to him and to trust in him. He has his people and he's patient, waiting for people to turn back to him. Because the thing we haven't touched on is, the hope that Jesus offers. It is for everyone, but not everyone will benefit from it. It is those who turn and trust in him who receive that hope and the reality of that hope. And so God is patient in giving people time to do that.
Thank you. And I think it's the last question here. Is the hope from Christianity different from other religions? Why would you pick Christianity over these other wide area of religions?
Yeah, good question, and lots you could say. I think, again, it comes back to the fact that the hope of Christianity is grounded in the resurrection of Jesus. It isn't just a series of ideas about God or an understanding of how do we get to God, or it is a hope that is grounded in a reality, and I think that is what Christianity offers, different from other religions. It's not just a hope that is sort of I don't know. My understanding is that in Islam, a Muslim can never have a full assurance that God will, that what they're hoping for they will reach, that they'll reach paradise. I think a Muslim would say that they can't know that for certain. A Hindu might hope to be reincarnated as something, something better in the next life, and they can do, they can try, but they can't have, they hope in that sense, but there's nothing tangible to to give them confidence of that. Whereas for the Christian, the hope is based on the resurrection of Jesus. If Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life, whoever believes in me, even though they die, will live," and he beats death, then that is a solid hope that I think other worldviews, other religions, ultimately don't have, and so that is the unique claim at the heart of Christianity.
Yep. Thank you for your talk and your answers to our questions. And we're really glad to have you here, Scott.
Pleasure.
So we are having some announcements now. So since this is the last CU online activity this term, so we will not have any online events later on, except prayer meetings. So prayer meetings will be held fortnightly, so every 2 weeks, and we will be starting our next prayer meeting on the 16th of June. So it will be we won't have prayer meetings next week, and then we will start it on the 16th. And make sure to check our Instagram